The Flaxborough Autumn Produce Show had for over 40 years been the nearest thing the town possessed to a religious festival. There were winners, losers, rivalries, and, as the local vicar once suggested, the faint aroma of original sin about the judging tent. On that particular Saturday, the tent stood in the middle of the recreation field, its canvas flapping and sighing like an anxious organist. Inside, the tables groaned under pyramids of marrows, regimented leeks, and the glossy complacency of apples arranged as if for inspection by royalty. Mrs. Dora Trundle, wife of the Reverend Lionel Trundle, had already taken 3 blue rosettes and 1 mild headache when the incident occurred. Her pièce de résistance, a monumental pumpkin of amber hue and suspicious symmetry, sat at the centre of Table C, its label proudly inscribed Exhibit No, 47, Mrs. D. Trundle, Cucurbita Maxima, Harvest Majesty. By mid-morning, the judges, 2 retired colonels and an alderman's wife, had completed their rounds. The tent hummed with the pleasant murmur of anticipation and sugar fumes. Then, just as Mrs. Trundle was explaining to Mrs. Glossop the superiority of horse manure over chemical fertilizer, someone, no one could later say quite who, remarked that the pumpkin had spoken. At first, laughter. Then, as the tent fell quiet, the sound came again. A faint, rasping murmur, as if a distant gramophone were whispering from inside the vegetable, "Edith! Marion!" The name lingered like a draught under a closed door. Mrs. Glossop shrieked, though she would later claim it was merely a hiccup. Colonel Weatherby dropped his clipboard. A small boy, seizing the moment, tried to lift the pumpkin, found it immovable, and fled screaming something about ghosts in gourds. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, the pumpkin had been cordoned off with 2 garden canes and a piece of bunting. Superintendent Chubb, sweating gently in his trilby, was attempting to appear authoritative in the face of vegetable ventriloquism. "Afternoon, Purbright." "Dashed silly business. Someone's put a wireless speaker in the blessed thing. I shouldn't wonder." Purbright, tall, grave-eyed and unhurried as usual, bent over the pumpkin. He tapped it lightly with his knuckle. The sound was dull, solid, no holes or wires visible. "Remarkably lifelike," he murmured. Chubb sniffed. "You mean lifelike for a pumpkin?" "For a confession," said Purbright softly. The superintendent frowned but decided not to pursue it. He preferred his mysteries tidily labelled before lunch. The crowd thickened as word spread. Flaxborough had not been this animated since the council treasurer's false teeth went missing during communion. Everyone had a theory. Mrs. Glossop declared it witchcraft. "My late husband once spoke through the gas fire for a week, dear." Mr. Teal, who ran the local electrical shop, swore someone had hidden a miniature radio inside. The vicar's wife fainted, a feat accomplished with such delicacy that several ladies rushed to assist while taking mental notes for future social use. By late afternoon, the pumpkin had been removed to the police station, where it sat in solitary confinement on the evidence table, its skin glowing benignly beneath the harsh fluorescent light. Sergeant Love, charged with guarding it, reported no further utterances, though he admitted feeling uncomfortable being alone with it after dark. Purbright spent the evening making notes, brief ones, neat and unembellished. He asked for a list of all entries in the produce show, especially those connected to the vicarage, the horticultural committee, and a certain Mrs. Merion. Mrs. Edith Merion, as the town knew, and as they had mostly agreed to stop mentioning, had been missing for 3 weeks. She was last seen leaving the church after choir practice, carrying a basket of quinces and an expression of mild indignation. The next morning, as fog settled over the river and the church bells began their hesitant peal, Purbright walked past the rectory garden. A mound of disturbed earth caught his attention near the pumpkin patch, carefully smoothed, yet imperfectly so. He stood for a while, hands clasped behind his back, regarding it as one might a page of handwriting whose meaning hovered just out of reach. Behind him, the vicar's wife appeared, pale but smiling, a shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders. "Oh, Inspector, you're admiring my little harvest, I see." "Indeed," said Purbright gently. "You've quite a gift for cultivation." She glanced at the soil, then back at him, her smile not quite steady. "One does one's best to keep things fresh." Purbright nodded, turned, and walked away, his gaze lowering briefly to the tip of his boot, where a smear of faint, greenish residue clung like dried pulp. By Monday morning, the incident of the whispering pumpkin had evolved into a form of folk opera. At the Flaxborough market, between the cabbage stall and the second-hand paperback trestle, it was performed, reliably and with embellishment, by every other tongue in town. "Spoke clear as day, it did," insisted Mrs. Glossop, now styling herself as both witness and victim. "Said Edith Merrion, and then gave a sort of sigh, like the gas going out." "That'll be nerves, my dear," murmured Mrs. Venn, a woman who considered nervous disorders a polite synonym for gossip. "You were never the same since. Your boiler went off, were you?" A butcher's boy listening nearby muttered. "I reckon it were that fairground fella. Always fiddling with wires, he is." And so, as easily as a chill spreads through damp wool, the theory of mechanical haunting took hold. By mid-morning, the market had achieved the peculiar hum only a small town can produce, a sound composed equally of denial, delight, and scandal. The town's version of truth was forming itself in layers, each one further from the original event, but far closer to what people found satisfactory. Inspector Purbright appeared in the market just after 11, walking with that mild deliberation. That gave the impression of leisure while gathering far more information than anyone suspected. He was accompanied, as usual, by Sergeant Love, a young man whose notions of crime owed more to cinema than criminology. "Begging your pardon, sir," said Love, "but I don't see why we don't just crack the thing open. Could save a lot of talk." Purbright's expression didn't change. "And deprive the good people of Flaxborough of their morning's entertainment? I'd hardly dare." They paused before the electrical shop. In the window, beside a display of hairdryers and one melancholy toaster, stood Mr. Teal, proprietor and self-proclaimed expert in modern marvels. He greeted Purbright with the satisfied air of a man whose theories had been publicly vindicated. "Ah, Inspector, I was saying only yesterday, had to be a wireless job. Tiny speaker, battery in the base, maybe a voice loop. I could do one myself if I wanted." "I should rather hope you don't," said Purbright mildly. "Would you happen to have sold such a device recently?" Teal frowned. "Sold? Not precisely. Lent, maybe. Bit of copper wire to the church for their harvest display wiring. The vicar's wife asked for it herself." "Did she now?" "Yes. Said it was for illumination purposes, though I'd say she's bright enough as it is." Purbright thanked him, made a few unreadable notes, and turned toward the church square. The square that morning was a picture of composure. Autumn leaves trembling over iron railings, the bakery window misted from the inside, and Mrs. Copplestone, rearranging chrysanthemums outside her florist's with the moral conviction of a woman sure flowers could restore the soul. Mrs. Copplestone had known Edith Merrion, as she'd known most women worth knowing or fearing. "Sweet voice, that one," she told Purbright when he inquired. Not like the vicar's wife, hers could curdle the communion wine. "She and Mrs. Trundle weren't close?" "Oh, I'd say they were close enough to be dangerous. You know how it is, Inspector. One woman's sympathy is another's curiosity." Purbright smiled faintly. "I do indeed." "And now this business with the pumpkin?" "I told my husband it's what happens when you meddle with nature. I don't even like courgettes, they've got ambitions." Purbright thanked her gravely and moved on, though his glance lingered at the mention of ambition. He had long observed that in Flaxborough, ambition, particularly the moral variety, was the root of most mischief. That afternoon, Superintendent Chubb summoned Purbright to his office, which smelled of polish and civic overconfidence. "Now then," Chubb began, slapping a report down. "Got word from County Lab. They poked at that pumpkin. No speaker. No trickery, just a hole where a bit of wiring might have been." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Might have been?" Chubb snorted. "They can't be certain. The thing's half rotten now, but between you and me, I'm ready to chalk this up to hysteria." "People see ghosts where there's gossip," Purbright nodded. "True. Yet gossip, when it travels this fast, often carries something heavier than rumour." Chubb gave him the wary look of a man hearing poetry when he expected paperwork. "Meaning?" "What? Meaning," said Purbright softly, "that when a town pretends it knows nothing, it's usually because it knows too much." He left the office with the air of someone who had no urgency, but a very clear direction. That evening, as dusk thickened over the rooftops, Purbright walked the path behind the vicarage. From a small gate he could see the garden, meticulously arranged, but oddly empty. The great pumpkin was gone, leaving only a shallow circular depression in the earth. The vicar's wife was visible through the kitchen window, her face pale in the glow of the lamp. She appeared to be writing something, short, hesitant movements, like a person composing not a letter, but an apology. At that moment the vicar himself stepped out from the side door, spotted Purbright, and waved with mild surprise. "Evening, Inspector. You've just missed Dora, gone to evensong practice." "Terribly upset, poor thing, I heard," said Purbright. "About the vegetable." "Vegetable?" The vicar chuckled nervously. "Oh, I dare say that'll be forgotten soon enough." "Bit of nonsense, eh?" Purbright tilted his head. "Possibly. But nonsense, when properly cultivated, can grow remarkably large." He smiled politely, bid the clergyman good night, and turned away, his mind working as quietly as his shoes upon the gravel. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was still staring at the now silent pumpkin on the evidence table. "Funny thing, sir," he said, as Purbright entered. "Every time I look at it, I keep thinking it's watching me." Purbright paused at the door, considered this, and replied, "Then it's learned the most human trick of all. Love, pretending to be harmless while noticing everything." He closed the office door behind him. The faint smell of earth and copper lingered. Inspector Purbright, if truth were told, enjoyed interviewing people in the same way a cat enjoys sunlight, quietly, unhurriedly, and with an inscrutable air that made others uncomfortable without ever knowing why. He had learned long ago that few people lied outright. Most, when afforded a long enough silence, betrayed themselves by trying too hard to fill it. And so on Tuesday morning, he began his visits. The kind that appeared casual, but were, in fact, a methodical rearrangement of the town's polite facades. The first stop was the vicarage drawing-room, a space filled with porcelain shepherdesses and the faint despair of genteel piety. Mrs. Dora Trundle sat by the window, wrapped in a shawl that looked capable of surviving minor frostbite. She greeted Purbright with a brittle composure. "Oh, Inspector, I do hope this silly business isn't causing more fuss than it deserves. One tries to be an example of calm in these things, you know." Purbright inclined his head. "You are no doubt a pillar of serenity. Still, the townsfolk seem unusually stirred. It isn't every day one hears a vegetable call out a missing woman's name." The vicar's wife gave a quick, uncertain laugh. "Coincidence, surely. Edith Merion's name, well, it's hardly uncommon. There were several Ediths in my school class, I remember." Purbright nodded pleasantly. Indeed, though the surname narrows it somewhat. She busied her hands with the edge of her teacup.
You don't really think anyone engineered such a grotesque trick, do you? That would be wicked. And besides, who would bother?
Purbright's expression remained unreadable. Wickedness, Mrs. Trundle, is often a matter of bother.
One seldom finds it among the lazy. Her eyes flickered, the faintest sign of irritation. He let the silence extend long enough to let the room's clock tick into audibility.
Then gently, "Did you know Mrs. Marion well?" "Oh, socially. Choir practice, fundraising, that sort of thing."
A very worthy woman, though somewhat sensitive.
"I fear she overreacted to matters others would take in stride." "What sort of matters?" Mrs. Trundle hesitated, then said with forced brightness, "Oh, small parish concerns, finances, I believe." "My husband would know more." Purbright smiled faintly, as if accepting a cup of invisible tea.
I see. And the copper wire you borrowed from Mr. Teal's shop. Was that for the display lighting?
"Why, yes," she replied quickly. "The harvest table had fairy lights. You must have seen them." "I did," said Purbright, "though I noticed the socket near the pumpkin was unused." Mrs. Trundle's lips parted. But before she could reply, the vicar himself entered, cheerfully oblivious.
Carrying a tray of sandwiches. "Ah, Inspector, come to save us from scandal, have you?"
"Dora's quite exhausted with all this ghostly nonsense." Purbright smiled politely. "I imagine she is." He rose, thanked them both, and departed, leaving the faint, cool breeze of doubt behind him. His second call took him to the fairground caravan parked on the outskirts of town, where Mr. Freddie Lunt, electrician and part-time illusionist,
was dismantling a broken fortune-telling booth. Pumpkin business, is it?
Freddie said, lighting a cigarette with greasy fingers. "Well, if you ask me, it's just static and imagination."
People hear anything they want. Voices, ghosts, old lovers, tacksmen. You've worked the produce show before.
Purbright asked. "Set up their power." "Aye. Did a few bits for the church, too." Mrs. Trundle likes her fairy lights just so. "Picky woman, but generous with her tea. Did she ask your help this year?"
Lunt scratched his chin. Only for some wiring scraps a week before the show.
"Said she wanted to make the pumpkin glow modestly." I thought that was a contradiction in terms, but there you are. "Did you deliver the wire yourself?" "Dropped it off at the vicarage gate." "Never went inside?" Purbright nodded. "And Mrs. Marion, you knew her?" Lunt shrugged.
Vaguely.
"Came round last month asking questions about some charity fund. Thought I'd been paid from it for work at the fairground. Told her I hadn't seen a penny. She looked worried. Proper worried, like she'd just realized something nasty." "What sort of fund?"
Church roof fund, maybe? There's always one. Purbright gave a small, thoughtful hum.
"Yes, there usually is." That afternoon, Purbright stopped by the church hall, where a knitting circle was in session. A dozen women sat in a ring, clacking needles and whispering about righteousness. The conversation halted the moment he entered. "Please don't stop on my account," Purbright said mildly. "I came only to ask about Mrs. Marion. Did she attend your meetings?" A woman with a face like well-ironed linen replied primly, "She did, until she started making accusations about the harvest charity accounts. Claimed some of the figures didn't add up. We told her she must have misread them."
She was always emotional, and did she misread them?
No one answered. The needles resumed their clacking faster now, as though the sound could sew the silence shut. Purbright bowed slightly. "Thank you, ladies. I shall let you return to your good works." Back at the station, the inspector stood by the evidence table, gazing at the silent pumpkin as dusk fell. Sergeant Love entered, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Funny thing, sir," Love said. "That fairground man Lunt, he's been on record before. Some trouble over illegal wiring. Bit of a tinkerer." Purbright accepted the tea, stirred it without drinking. People who like to tinker, Love, are rarely content to stop at machines. He reached into his pocket and drew out the scrap of copper wire he'd found beneath the show table, twisted at one end, cut neatly at the other. "Do you suppose, Love," he said quietly, "that a woman could manage such wiring herself?" Depends which woman, sir. Indeed, Purbright murmured, slipping the wire back into its envelope. It always does. He moved to the window. Outside, the gas lamps flickered on across the market square, their light soft upon the shop fronts. Respectable, familiar, and faintly deceitful. Somewhere beneath that glow, Purbright thought, the truth was already shifting shape, making itself comfortable in the dark. By Wednesday afternoon, the Whispering Pumpkin had become yesterday's miracle. The town's appetite for the supernatural had been replaced, as it always was, by the far more reliable nourishment of self-congratulation. Flaxborough, in its collective wisdom, had decided that the incident was settled. The Clarion, the local paper, devoted a single column to it under the headline, "Hoaxed by Halloween? Vicar's wife, blameless in whispering squash scandal." The piece was short, badly punctuated, and full of relief. Superintendent Chubb was in his best mood since the Queen's Jubilee. He summoned Inspector Purbright to his office and gestured at a teetering stack of reports with the air of a man signing an armistice. "There you have it, Purbright."
Lunt's your culprit.
He's admitted it was a trick, rigged up the pumpkin with leftover fairground wiring. Claims he wanted to spice up the show. Purbright, seated opposite, regarded his superior with mild curiosity.
And the name it whispered?
Edith Marion. Rather specific for a prank, don't you think? Chubb waved a hand.
Coincidence.
Says he recorded random nonsense from a wireless broadcast, fiddled it into a loop. Probably some advert for jam. Purbright's eyebrows lifted slightly. Most advertisements don't sigh the names of missing women, sir. Chubb's moustache twitched defensively. You're overthinking.
Fellows confessed. No harm done.
Besides, Mrs. Marion will turn up. They always do. Women wander off, find themselves, then come back to complain about the search effort. Purbright smiled faintly. A rather sweeping hypothesis. It's experience, my boy, said Chubb with satisfaction.
Case closed.
Tell Love to box that pumpkin up and send it for compost. I want my desk free of vegetables by Friday. But Purbright, who never mistook relief for resolution, did not share his superior's appetite for tidy endings. He spent the afternoon revisiting the fairground electrician's confession. Freddie Lunt, summoned once more to the station, looked less the criminal mastermind and more the hapless scapegoat. I only said I might have done it, Lunt protested. Chubb told me I'd best admit or they'd fine me for obstruction. I never touched that pumpkin after dropping off the wire.
Honest, Inspector, I've done tricks before but not this one.
Too neat by half, Purbright regarded him thoughtfully. Then why confess at all? Lunt's eyes darted toward the corridor. 'Cause someone told me to.
Said it'd save a lot of unpleasantness, woman's voice.
Came to the caravan after dark, left 10 quid on the step. Did you recognize her? Lunt shook his head. Couldn't see her face proper. But she smelt of lavender water. Strong sort. Church bazaar quality. Purbright closed his notebook. You've been very helpful, Mr. Lunt. Don't go far. That evening, Flaxborough's weather turned theatrical. A restless wind pushed at the church steeple, scattering the last of the autumn leaves across the square. The lamps flickered like stage lights, unsure of their cue. Purbright, walking home past the vicarage, paused once more by the garden gate. The soil beneath the pumpkin patch had settled, too smooth now, too deliberate. Someone had retamped it. He stood quite still, listening. The faint hiss of the wind through the hedges made a curious impression, like breath drawn between teeth. Then a voice behind him. Admiring the view again, Inspector? It was Mrs. Trundle. She had appeared soundlessly, wrapped in a shawl the colour of old parchment. It's a fine garden, Purbright said. Your pumpkins do especially well, she smiled thinly. The Lord rewards those who tend his earth. Indeed, he murmured. Though one wonders if he's always particular about what's buried in it. Her eyes met his. For the briefest moment, calm and glassy like the surface of a frozen pond. Then she gave a short, brittle laugh. Oh, you policeman! always thinking in morbid metaphors. "Good evening, Inspector." She moved past him toward the church lane, her figure diminishing into the lamplight. Purbright watched until she vanished, then bent slightly, plucked something from the soil, and examined it under his pocket torch, a thin thread of copper wire, tangled with a few strands of dried vine. The next morning, Chubb's good mood had grown to pompous satisfaction. He'd drafted a formal statement to the press and even hinted that a commendation might be in order. Purbright, invited to sign the paperwork, appeared to oblige, then quite accidentally dropped the superintendent's pen as he stooped to pick it up. His eye caught a small object under the blotter, a brown envelope marked "Evidence, Produce Show, Table C." He lifted it. Inside was the same copper wire fragment he'd submitted days earlier, or so he thought. This one, however, was clean, gleaming, and precisely snipped. Not the earth-smudged piece he'd found beneath the pumpkin. Someone had replaced it. He looked up. Chubb, oblivious, was humming "Onward, Christian Soldiers" and stamping his approval onto Lunt's file. Purbright slid the envelope quietly into his coat pocket. That evening, as the town prepared for the harvest Thanksgiving service, Purbright walked alone along the riverbank. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and lamp oil. He reflected, as he often did, on the peculiar English hunger for closure, how people loved nothing so much as a comfortable explanation. But truth, he thought, was rarely comfortable. It tended to sit where it wasn't wanted, like a forgotten guest at tea. Somewhere behind the church a bell tolled softly, and in its echo he thought he heard, though perhaps it was only imagination, a faint whisper. Edith. He turned toward the vicarage lights. The following morning began in the ordinary Flaxborough way, slowly, with a faint smell of boiled cabbage and resignation. Mist clung to the rooftops, turning chimneys into the silhouettes of half-finished thoughts. The town's newspaper, damp from the press, lay in doorways like gossip that hadn't quite learned to stand upright. By 8 o'clock, a minor commotion had begun outside St. Jude's Church. Mrs. Pamela Hodge, retired postmistress and full-time guardian of local morality, had made a discovery of such delicate impropriety that she had marched straight to the vicarage, letter in hand, demanding a constable with discretion and boots polished. Purbright arrived 15 minutes later. He found Mrs. Hodge standing in the porch,
shawl pinned tight, face sharp with the thrill of revelation.
Between two gloved fingers she held an envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, the handwriting tremulous and unmistakably elderly. It were lying behind the hymn board.
"Inspector," she announced, like it had been hidden there.
And before you ask, I didn't steam it open, though heaven knows I was tempted. Purbright accepted the letter carefully. The name written in faded ink read, Mrs. Marion. "Found in the church porch, you say?" "Indeed, I clean there every Wednesday, same as always. This morning I noticed a bit of paper sticking out." "Must have been there weeks," Purbright nodded. "You're quite sure no one else has touched it?" Mrs. Hodge sniffed.
"Only God, and he doesn't use stamps." He gave a small smile at that, then slipped the envelope into his inner pocket.
"Thank you, Mrs. Hodge. Your restraint does you credit." "Oh, I'm full of it, Inspector," she replied tartly. "But I should like it noted I've never found a letter that didn't mean trouble." Back at the station, Purbright sat at his desk and studied the envelope under the desk lamp. The paper had been sealed and resealed, faint traces of wax, then tape. The flap lifted easily with a letter knife. Inside, folded twice, was a single sheet. The handwriting wavered, the ink uneven as though written by an unsteady hand or one pressed for time. The message contained only 7 words. I couldn't keep it buried any longer. No signature, no date. Sergeant Love, peering over Purbright's shoulder, frowned.
Buried, sir?"
Could mean anything. Purbright leaned back in his chair. It could. But in Flaxborough, buried is a word best taken literally, Love blinked.
You think she meant?
I think, Purbright said softly, that someone wanted this never to reach Mrs. Marion, which suggests the sender cared about her and feared her in equal measure. At noon, Purbright took a quiet stroll through the churchyard. The grass was slick with dew, the gravestones leaning like old men comparing aches. He noted how the soil near the side gate had been recently disturbed, fresh earth spread thinly, as though to disguise some earlier activity. From within the church, the organ began a hesitant prelude. Mrs. Trundle's silhouette passed across a stained glass window, her movements careful, precise. She was alone, arranging flowers on the altar. Purbright entered through the side door. "Ah, Mrs. Trundle," he said, his voice light. "Preparing for tomorrow's harvest service." She turned, startled but quickly composed. "Yes, Inspector. One must maintain beauty even in troubled times," he nodded. "Quite so. It's remarkable how Flaxborough manages to preserve appearances, no matter what lies underneath." Her smile was faint, uncertain. "I suppose that's English character, or English habit," he said mildly.
"I was told Mrs. Marion once assisted with the floral arrangements." A pause.
"Then she did. But she was, how shall I say, untidy in spirit. Always rearranging what wasn't hers." Purbright let that hang in the air. Then he said quietly, "Someone left a letter for her."
"In this church?" That made her hands tremble slightly, enough to dislodge a petal. "A letter? Good heavens, how unsettling." "It was never posted," Purbright continued.
It read, "I couldn't keep it buried any longer." Would that phrase mean anything to you? She met his eyes then, briefly, directly, and for that instant, something flashed behind them, not fear exactly, but the flicker of a person deciding how much truth politeness would permit. "I'm afraid not," she said. "But you do have a talent for the dramatic, Inspector." Purbright inclined his head.
"So I've been told."
"Forgive the intrusion, Mrs. Trundle. We do carry on." He turned to go. As he reached the door, she called after him, lightly but too quickly, "Inspector, where did you say the letter was found?" "I didn't," he said, and stepped out into the rain. Later that evening, he sat at his kitchen table with the letter unfolded before him. His tea had gone cold. He traced the handwriting slowly, not for style, but for rhythm. It was a hand accustomed to careful, deliberate movement. The words themselves had been written with pauses, each one heavier than the ink itself. "I couldn't keep it buried any longer." It was, Purbright thought, the kind of line one writes either before confession or before being stopped. He leaned back and gazed out the window, where the rain streaked the glass in uneven lines, like lines scratched through memory. A knock at the door interrupted him. Sergeant Love stood outside, rain dripping from his hat brim.
Sorry to bother you at home, sir."
"We've had a report from the vicar." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Oh, says Mrs. Trundle's fainted during choir practice."
"Proper collapse."
"He sent for the doctor." Purbright rose, took his coat.
"A pity," he said softly.
"Illness has such inconvenient timing." When he arrived at the vicarage, the scene was as neat as ever. The drawing-room glowed with lamplight. The vicar fussed with cushions while a doctor packed his bag. Mrs. Trundle lay pale but conscious on the sofa, a glass of brandy by her side. "She's had a shock, Inspector," the doctor murmured. "Best not trouble her with questions." "Of course," Purbright replied, but his eyes had already found what they were looking for. On the small writing desk in the corner, a blotter, a fountain pen, and a half-finished sheet of notepaper. The handwriting, though disguised by haste, bore the same loops and uneven pressure as the letter in his pocket. He stepped forward, seemingly casual, and noted the line she had begun before fainting. "There is something under the vine." He folded the letter in his coat and turned to the doctor. "When she wakes," he said quietly, "tell her she's been most helpful." Outside, the wind had risen again. The church bell tolled once, hesitant, uncertain, like a warning whispered too late. For a town that prided itself on quiet living, Flaxborough had begun to sound uncomfortably alive. The wind had grown restive. The church bell rang at odd hours, as if uncertain of its duties, and by the time Thursday arrived, a new disturbance joined the list, less supernatural perhaps, but more humanly inconvenient. It began at the fairground, where the morning mist smelled faintly of oil and panic. Mr. Freddie Lunt stood beside his generator, staring at it as though it had personally betrayed him. The metal casing was blackened, one side caved in by what appeared to be a deliberate blow. The fair's lights were dead, the tea-van powerless, and the local children deprived of their morning's illicit thrill. It were fine last night, Lunt shouted as Purbright and Sergeant Love approached. Now look at it, like it's swallowed a thunderstorm. Purbright crouched beside the wrecked machinery. His finger traced the dented casing, then the twisted fragment of copper wire dangling from the coil. Someone struck it with something heavy, he murmured, then removed the magneto-plate. Neat work, oddly selective, Love whistled. Sabotage, sir? Sabotage or conscience, Purbright said. They often use the same tools, Lunt scratched his head.
Conscience?
I've not got one worth stealing, Purbright straightened, brushing dust from his knees. Then you'll have noticed if anyone borrowed yours. Did you see anyone about last night? Only the vicar's missus, Lunt said after a pause. Came round near dusk looking for her wire back. Said she'd lent too much to the church display. Odd time for gardening errands, I thought. Purbright's expression didn't change. Did she get what she came for? Didn't have any to give her. Told her so. She went off in a bit of a huff. Thank you, said Purbright. You've been most enlightening. By noon the town had new gossip. Word spread that the fair was cursed. Someone claimed to have seen blue sparks leaping from the Ferris wheel. Another insisted a ghostly woman's voice had been heard humming near the vicarage. The details shifted with each retelling, like a choir singing different hymns in the same key. Meanwhile, Mrs. Trundle had confined herself to her room for health reasons. Her husband, the Reverend Lionel Trundle, assured visitors she merely needed rest. A touch of nerves, nothing sinful. Purbright, however, was not among the reassured. That afternoon, he paid a visit to the vicarage pantry, officially to return the church key, unofficially to satisfy a lingering suspicion. He was greeted by the vicar's housemaid, a solemn girl named Elsie, who regarded the world as something that might,
at any moment, need sweeping. Oh, that pumpkin,
she said when he asked. Gone, sir. Mrs. Trundle had it taken away last night. Said it had spoiled and smelled queer. Taken where? Didn't say. Just told the gardener to fetch his wheelbarrow and be quick. Purbright nodded, thanked her, and left her polishing tins of treacle with moral fervour. In the hall, the vicar intercepted him, his expression a careful blend of cordiality and mild defensiveness. Still chasing ghosts, Inspector? Only the ones that don't know they're dead, Purbright replied pleasantly. Your wife's health improving, I hope? She's resting, yes. This nonsense has been hard on her nerves, I can imagine, and the human voice, even imagined, can be quite disturbing when it says the wrong thing. The vicar frowned. What do you mean? Purbright smiled slightly.
Only that a whisper is a very particular choice of volume, don't you think?
One speaks quietly only when one knows the listener. He tipped his hat and left the vicar standing in the hall, perplexed as the faint sound of the church clock punctuated the silence. That evening, the wind returned with more insistence, rattling the windows of the police station like an impatient messenger. Purbright sat at his desk, reviewing the letter found in the church. There is something under the vine. I couldn't keep it buried any longer. He lit his pipe, not to smoke, but to think, and considered how many things in Flaxborough were currently under something, secrets under politeness, guilt under duty, and perhaps something far less metaphorical under the vicarage vines. At 9 o'clock, Sergeant Love entered, looking unsettled. "Sir, we've had another call." "From the vicarage?" "Ah." Purbright didn't look up.
Let me guess. Mrs. Trundle has fainted again. Not this time, sir. They've had a break-in.
Pantry door forced. "Nothing stolen, though." "Nothing visible, perhaps," said Purbright, rising. "Let's go." The vicarage kitchen, when they arrived, smelled of spilled flour and brandy. A window pane hung cracked, rain drifting in. The vicar hovered anxiously near the door. "Inspector."
Thank goodness. It's dreadful.
"Someone's broken in and rifled the pantry. But they've taken nothing." Purbright moved past him, examining the scene with a calm eye. The cupboard doors hung open, tins scattered. Only one area seemed curiously undisturbed, the corner where the pumpkin had been kept. A faint ring of damp marked the floorboards there, circular, dark, and freshly wiped. "Where's your gardener?" he asked. "Left early this morning." "Something about his sister's rheumatism." Purbright crouched, running a finger across the damp ring. The residue clung faintly, not of water, but of soil and vegetable pulp. Beside it, near the skirting board, glimmered a small metal clasp, the kind used to fasten a mechanical lid. He pocketed it discreetly. "Inspector?" the vicar stammered. "Surely you don't think—" Purbright turned, smiling almost kindly. "Oh, I try not to think at all, Reverend. It only complicates the evidence." He straightened, brushed his coat sleeve. "You'll want that window repaired. Things left open have a way of letting the truth in." By the next morning, word of the pantry burglary had joined the town's repertoire of marvels. Mrs. Glossop was certain it was gypsies. Mr. Teal
Swore it was a bat, and Mrs. Hodge told anyone
who'd listened that it was God reclaiming his vegetables, but Purbright for once did not correct them. He merely filed the clasp into an envelope marked "Recovered Fragments." Then he locked his office drawer and wrote one note in his slow, deliberate hand: "If she buried the truth beneath the vine, she may now be digging it up herself." He folded it neatly, placed it beside the letter to Mrs. Marion, and extinguished the lamp. Outside, the wind had fallen quiet, but the silence it left behind was not peace, only the waiting kind. Friday dawned thin and brittle, the kind of morning that gave the impression of waiting for bad news. The air in Flaxborough was still, unnaturally so. Even the pigeons appeared to coo more softly, as if gossip itself had developed a conscience. Inspector Purbright, however, was in no hurry. He sat in his office, reading the Clarion's latest effort, a headline that blared, "The Pious Pumpkin, Vicar's Wife Struck by Nerves, Fairground Man Cleared." He folded the paper neatly, as though tucking in a restless child, and turned to Sergeant Love. "Notice anything interesting, Love?" Love, whose idea of interest was usually limited to tea breaks and motorbikes, blinked. "Sir? The article clears Mr. Lunt," Purbright said, "but nowhere does it mention who suggested his guilt in the first place. The town has quietly misplaced its accuser." "Always a promising sign," Love frowned.
You think someone planted the story?
"Someone usually does," said Purbright. "Truth in Flaxborough is rather like topsoil, always freshly rearranged." He stood, put on his coat.
Come along, love. We're calling on Mr. Sturrock.
Mr. Herbert Sturrock, solicitor, sat behind a mahogany desk large enough to conceal a moderate scandal. His office smelled faintly of ink, dust, and the kind of secrets that never quite reached confession. Purbright, who disliked wasting politeness on lawyers, nevertheless greeted him with professional civility. "Morning."
Mr. Sturrock, I believe you handled the affairs of Mrs. Edith Marion. Sturrock pursed his lips, the legal equivalent of drawing a sword. I may have done.
"May I inquire why the police take an interest in a simple missing person case?" "Because," Purbright replied gently, "the case refuses to remain simple." He laid the recovered letter on the desk. Sturrock adjusted his spectacles, read the single line, and sighed as though burdened by inevitability. I was afraid something like this would surface, he said finally. Then perhaps you'll illuminate me. Sturrock tapped the letter thoughtfully. Mrs. Marion approached me about a month ago, claiming she'd discovered discrepancies in the parish charity accounts. Funds intended for the church roof restoration had been, shall we say, misallocated. Misallocated, Purbright repeated. A charming euphemism. The money, Sturrock continued, was drawn in small sums, a pattern invisible unless one examined the ledgers closely. Mrs. Marion believed someone at the vicarage was diverting the donations into personal projects. Did she have proof? She had suspicions, said Sturrock, and she asked for my advice before confronting the vicar's wife.
I urged caution. She
did not take it. Purbright's gaze sharpened slightly. And what happened after that? 2 days later, she vanished. Did Mrs. Trundle ever contact you? Once, Sturrock said after a pause, to ask whether Mrs. Marion had deposited any documents. I told her no. She thanked me and remarked that Mrs. Marion was given to exaggeration. That was all. Purbright stood.
Thank you, Mr. Sturrock. You've been most helpful. I rather doubt that, murmured the solicitor.
But I've no desire to see another client buried under parish paperwork. On the way back, Love broke the silence. So Mrs. Marion found out the church fund was being skimmed. Perhaps not skimmed, said Purbright. That implies profit. This was likely something subtler. Concealment, not gain. Concealment of what, sir? Of embarrassment, Love. The most English of currencies. Love looked baffled, but didn't press the matter. At dusk, Purbright stopped at the church hall, where preparations for the harvest Thanksgiving were underway. The tables were being laid with the usual abundance of virtue. Fruit pyramids, tinned peaches, and several cakes that looked both pious and inedible. He found Mrs. Copplestone arranging hymn sheets. Mrs. Copplestone, I trust the Lord's produce is in good order. Better than the council's, she replied briskly. We've done without proper lighting since the fairground business. Half the choirs tripped over the tangerines. Purbright smiled. A small price for salvation. Tell me, do you happen to recall who handled the charity funds for the church roof? Why, Mrs. Trundle, of course, she said, as though it were obvious. And Mrs. Marion assisted with the receipts.
At least until the unpleasantness. What unpleasantness?
Oh, the usual feminine drama, Mrs. Copplestone said, lowering her voice. Mrs. Marion accused the vicar's wife of pocketing the donations.
Said she had proof.
Dreadful scene in the vestry, apparently. Then next week, poof, Mrs. Marion gone. Quite spoiled the Lent flower rota. Purbright inclined his head. You're a veritable archive, Mrs. Copplestone. Do keep your minutes. One day they'll hang a murderer. She laughed uncertainly. Oh, Inspector, you do have a morbid wit. That night, Purbright sat alone at his desk. The lamp cast a cone of amber light over a growing constellation of papers. The unsent letter, the forged accounts, the missing pumpkin, the faint residue of soil. He opened his notebook and drew a small diagram, names connected by dotted lines. At the centre, he wrote, Money, Respectability, Fear. He was still studying it when Sergeant Love entered holding a telegram. From County, sir. About Mrs. Marion. Purbright unfolded it and read silently. His eyes narrowed just slightly. Body found in River Trench. Identification pending. Clothing matches description. Marion stop possible foul play. Stoppy folded the telegram carefully, slipped it into his breast pocket, and said, in a voice neither hurried nor surprised, Love, fetch your coat. We'll need to see the vicar before he hears the news elsewhere. The vicarage drawing-room was half-lit, the fire long since dead. The Reverend Trundle sat in his armchair, collar askew, eyes hollow with sleeplessness. Purbright spoke gently. I'm afraid we've had word from County. A body's been recovered from the river. They believe it may be Mrs. Marion, the vicar sagged. Dear Lord, poor woman. She must have taken her own life. Possibly, said Purbright, though the bruising suggests otherwise. He paused.
Tell me, Reverend, do you keep your financial ledgers here?
The vicar blinked.
Yes, in the study. Why?
I'd like to see them. The man hesitated. They're hardly relevant, Inspector. On the contrary, Purbright replied mildly. Money rarely hides alone. After a moment's internal struggle, the vicar nodded and led him to the study. The room smelled faintly of must and old sermons. From a drawer, he produced a leather-bound ledger. Purbright flipped through it. The columns of numbers were tidy, the handwriting consistent. But near the back, one page had been torn out cleanly. "When was this last balanced?" he asked. "About 3 weeks ago, I think. The week Mrs. Merrion vanished." The vicar's lips tightened. "Dora keeps the details."
I trust her implicitly. Purbright closed the ledger softly.
"Then let us hope your trust is more carefully accounted for than your books." As Purbright left the vicarage, the first flakes of early frost drifted down. He stood for a long time at the garden gate, eyes fixed upon the patch where the vines grew thickest, a tangle of stems heavy with decay. Beneath them, the soil looked faintly disturbed again. He exhaled, a slow white breath in the cold air. "Love," he said quietly, "tomorrow we dig." The Crown and Anchor was not a place where revelations occurred. It was where they were softened. For 30 years it had absorbed Flaxborough's weekly quota of disappointment, self-justification, and marital compromise. Its air was the colour of sepia and resignation. Inspector Purbright sat in his habitual corner, a pint before him untouched, the glass beaded faintly with condensation. Sergeant Love sat opposite, already halfway through his own, regarding his superior with a blend of admiration and bewilderment. "You don't think she did it, do you, sir?" he asked, finally. Purbright lifted his gaze from the amber depths of his beer. "Define did it, love, Mrs. Trundle, the vicar's wife. Everyone's saying it now, that she killed Mrs. Merrion." "Everyone," said Purbright, "says precisely what makes their world comfortable again. Murder, in the public imagination, is much tidier than fraud. You can bury a body after all."
But embarrassment, well, that lingers, Love frowned.
"So you don't believe it's murder?" "Oh, I believe something very unpleasant occurred. But I doubt Mrs. Trundle thought of it in those terms. Few killers do until afterward." He paused, tapping his finger lightly against the glass. "Tell me, love, have you ever noticed how the worst crimes in small towns are always domestic in shape? Theft of face, misappropriation of virtue."
"That sort of thing," Love chuckled uncertainly.
"You make sin sound like bookkeeping, sir." "Not entirely different enterprises," Purbright murmured. Outside, the wind pressed against the pub windows,
rattling them like someone anxious to confess.
The fire popped occasionally, filling the pauses between thoughts. Love leaned forward. "About that letter, sir, the one to Mrs. Merrion. I couldn't keep it buried any longer. You think it came from the vicar's wife, don't you?" Purbright didn't answer immediately.
"It's possible."
"But there's a peculiarity. The letter was meant for Mrs. Merrion, not about her, which suggests remorse rather than accusation. So she meant to tell her something?" "Perhaps," said Purbright. "Or perhaps she meant to warn her." "It's a delicate distinction." Love frowned again, trying to catch the thread of thought. "But the body, sir, if that turns out to be her—" Purbright interrupted softly. "If it is Mrs. Merrion, and if she didn't fall by accident, then the person responsible has been punishing themselves ever since." Love stared.
"You mean Mrs. Trundle?"
Purbright gave a thin smile. "Or someone near enough to her that their guilt required pruning." At that moment, Mr. Teal, the electrical shopkeeper, entered the pub, shaking off the rain. He spotted Purbright and approached, with the kind of eagerness that often heralded accidental usefulness. "Evening, Inspector."
"Heard the latest?"
"They say the vicar's wife's been taken poorly again. Doctor called twice today." "Indeed?" said Purbright mildly. "And what's the diagnosis this time? Supernatural fatigue?" Teal laughed too loudly. "Wouldn't surprise me. Between that pumpkin nonsense and the body in the river, I'd be sickly too." Purbright regarded him. "You seem remarkably well informed," Teal shrugged. "Word gets about. Vicar sent the gardener to fetch something from my shop. Bit of wire, couple of batteries. Said it was for lighting in the vestry. Can't think what for, though." "Ah," Purbright's tone was gentle but firm. "When was this?" "Yesterday morning." "Did Mrs. Trundle accompany him?" "No, sir." "But she was waiting outside in the car, looked pale as chalk." Purbright nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Teal. Always a pleasure to learn your wires remain in demand." Teal, uncertain whether he'd been thanked or dismissed, mumbled a farewell and left to spread his own version of the exchange. When he'd gone, Love leaned in again. "That's twice she's asked after wiring. First for the pumpkin, now the vestry. What's she building, sir? A confession by electricity?" Purbright smiled. "Perhaps a different sort of illumination. Guilt, love is a restless mechanic. It keeps tinkering until something sparks." He set his glass aside and grew thoughtful. "You recall the copper clasp we found near the pantry floor?" "Yes, sir. Looked like it came from a lid or casing." "Exactly. A small housing, perhaps for a transmitter. Something that could project a sound, a whisper, for instance." "Hidden in a pumpkin." Love blinked. "So the voice wasn't supernatural at all?" "No," Purbright said softly. "It was very human."
A woman calling to herself across the threshold of her own conscience. Love stared blankly.
"You mean Mrs. Trundle made the pumpkin whisper her name?" Purbright's tone was almost kind. "Not her own, love. Edith Merrian's. It's a curious thing. Sometimes the guilty wish to be haunted, if only to know they still have a soul left to be troubled." Love looked down at his empty glass, as though suspecting the beer had been laced with philosophy. The pub clock chimed 9. Outside, the lamps glowed dimly through rain, casting halos that blurred the distinction between mist and smoke. Purbright rose, pulling on his coat. "You off, sir?" "Yes. There's something I wish to look at before the frost sets in." "Whereabouts?" "The vicarage garden," Love swallowed. "You mean the vines?" "Among other things." "Bring a spade, would you?" Love groaned quietly. "Always after closing time, isn't it?" The vicarage was dark except for a light in an upstairs window. The garden below was silvered by moonlight, the vine leaves heavy and slick with dew. The soil beneath them had been disturbed yet again, fresh ridges and shallow furrows as though someone had been trying to plant the night itself. Purbright handed Love the spade.
"Carefully."
Just near the root of that large vine, Love knelt, began digging. Within minutes the blade struck something firm.
A faint, hollow sound followed. "Wood, sir," he whispered. They cleared away more earth.
A small wooden box emerged, no larger than a shoebox, bound with wire, and marked faintly with rust. Purbright lifted it gently and pried it open. Inside lay a ledger, wrapped in oilcloth, edges stained dark. The pages, though damp, were legible, lines of neat arithmetic, each column ending with small transfers from the roof fund to an account marked D.T. Love exhaled. Dora Trundle, Purbright nodded. Not stolen then, merely redirected, likely to cover other losses. But Mrs. Merrian discovered it and spoke too loudly. Love's voice was hushed. So she confronted her and paid for it? Perhaps not at once, Purbright said. Perhaps remorse came later, when the body in the river began whispering louder than sermons. He closed the ledger carefully, brushing soil from his cuffs. "Truth, love," he said, "is like gardening. You can prune it, hide it, even bury it for a season. But it always insists on coming up again, usually at the wrong time." They stood for a moment in silence, the air cold and damp, the church bell marking the quarter hour like a weary conscience. When they returned to the road, Purbright looked back at the house, its windows dark, its vines shivering faintly in the wind. "She's not finished yet," he said softly. "There's one more thing she'll try to do before the service tomorrow." Love looked uneasy.
"You think she'll run, sir?"
Purbright's eyes remained on the lightless window. "No, love, she'll repent. And repentance in Flaxborough," he added dryly, "is almost always public." The vicarage drawing-room glowed with the fragile warmth of civility. A fire too cautious to blaze, conversation too careful to mean much. On the surface, it was a perfectly ordinary supper, cucumber sandwiches, Madeira cake, and the faintly medicinal aroma of well-behaved anxiety, Inspector. Purbright had accepted the Reverend Trundle's invitation with the mild reluctance of a man who knew hospitality in Flaxborough often served as camouflage. Sergeant Love, in his best and least comfortable jacket, stood by the door looking like a curate's apology. The vicar was in a good humour, the kind that comes from pretending not to know what one fears. His wife, Dora, sat very still beside the fire. The lamplight showed the pallor of her face, the stiffness in her smile. "Do take another sandwich, Inspector," she said, her voice brittle. "You hardly touched the first." "Tempting," said Purbright, "but I find conversation fills me quite adequately." Her hand trembled faintly as she lifted her teacup. "You policemen are always watching what people say, only when they've stopped saying what they mean," he replied. The vicar, sensing something treacherous beneath the surface, attempted to steer the talk towards safer waters. "Terrible business about that body, eh? The poor woman, Mrs. Marion, was it?" "We must pray it's not her," Purbright nodded. "Yes, we'll have confirmation soon enough. Curious thing, though. Whoever she was, she'd been in the water some time, but not long enough for her shoes to decay." Mrs. Trundle looked up sharply. "Her shoes?" "New," said Purbright mildly. "Fine leather. Mud on the soles, riverbank mud, not from the streets. Suggests she didn't walk far before she rested." The vicar muttered a prayer under his breath. Love coughed and tried to look invisible. Purbright turned toward the fire, his tone conversational. "You know, it's odd how small details can haunt one."
A misplaced object, a faint smell of copper, or a whisper one swears came from a pumpkin. The air seemed to freeze. Mrs. Trundle's cup clattered into its saucer. "Really, Inspector, must we revive that nonsense?"
"I think we must," said Purbright gently. "You see, it wasn't nonsense. The voice was genuine enough, recorded on a small speaker hidden in the pumpkin's cavity. Clever work, though crude. It repeated only one phrase, Edith Marion." The vicar stared at him. "Recorded?"
"But who would—"
"Someone," Purbright interrupted softly, "who needed the town to believe that Edith Marion's ghost was still speaking."
"A voice from the grave is a convenient distraction from a ledger in the soil." Mrs. Trundle rose abruptly. "Inspector, this is intolerable."
"You have no right to come into our home. On the contrary," said Purbright, still calm, "I came because you invited me." Her voice rose, tremulous now.
If you believe for a moment that I would—" Purbright leaned forward slightly.
"Believe? Oh, Mrs. Trundle, belief is for the pulpit. I prefer evidence." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small object, the metal clasp recovered from the pantry floor. He set it on the tablecloth. This was part of the device that made your pumpkin whisper. You see, it takes very little to give the impression of the supernatural. A bit of wiring, a few words recorded in the dark. She stared at it as though it were a live thing. The vicar looked from his wife to Purbright.
"Dora, for heaven's sake, tell him it isn't true."
She turned to her husband, her face suddenly stricken. Not with guilt alone, but the exhaustion of someone who had carried it too long. "Lionel, I only wanted to frighten them."
"To make them leave it alone." "Frighten who?"
he demanded. She looked to the inspector, almost pleading. "Mrs. Marion," Purbright said quietly. "You wanted her silence, but when she disappeared, your conscience found a louder voice."
"So you built yourself a haunting?" "No," Dora whispered.
"It wasn't like that. She came here that night."
"Said she'd tell the bishop."
"Said I'd ruined Lionel's name. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen." Her husband's voice was a faint rasp.
"Dora, what did you do?" "It was an accident," she said, the words tumbling now. "She fell?"
She hit her head on the paving by the vines.
"I panicked. I thought if I buried her."
If I prayed hard enough, her hands were shaking so violently that the teacup tipped, dark liquid spilling like ink across the cloth. Purbright watched without triumph. "You chose the pumpkin patch. How very English of you, Tai, to conceal sin beneath the symbols of harvest." She gave a strangled laugh, half sob. I kept hearing her voice after.
"I thought if everyone heard it too, it wouldn't be just me."
"It wouldn't be madness." The vicar sank into his chair, face ashen. The fire hissed softly, devouring its own ashes. Purbright stood, his tone formal, but not unkind. "Mrs. Trundle, you understand what will happen now?" She looked up at him, the shadow of dignity returning. "Yes, Inspector."
"I've lived among sermons too long to mistake them for mercy." The vicar whispered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps an apology. Purbright signalled to Love, who moved awkwardly toward the door.
As they reached it, Dora Trundle spoke once more, her voice strangely calm. "Inspector," she said, "when you heard the whisper in that pumpkin—"
"Did you believe it?"
Purbright paused. For a moment, perhaps.
"But belief, Mrs. Trundle, is a dangerous habit in a detective." He inclined his head and left them to their silence. Outside, the night was heavy with frost.
The church tower loomed against the starlight, bell motionless but waiting. Love broke the silence as they reached the gate. "You knew she'd crack, didn't you, sir?" Purbright didn't answer immediately. He lit his pipe, the flame flickering pale in the cold air. "I suspected she'd tell the truth," he said finally. Cracking was optional. They walked on, their footsteps crunching softly on the frozen ground. From behind them came a faint, wavering sound, not quite a sob, not quite a prayer. Just a whisper carried on the wind. By dawn the frost lay like white confession upon every hedge and rooftop in Flaxborough. The town's chimneys exhaled small plumes of repentance, and the streets, silent, scrubbed by the cold, seemed to hold their breath in expectation. The vicarage, however, was already awake. Its front door stood ajar, a sign of disorder so uncharacteristic that even the milkman hesitated on the step before leaving his bottles and retreating quickly, as though proximity to scandal might chill the cream. Inside, Inspector Purbright sat opposite the Reverend Trundle in the drawing-room. The curtains were still drawn, the fire unlit. Between them on the table lay the oilcloth-wrapped ledger, the letter addressed to Mrs. Merrion, and a small wooden box lined with copper wiring. Mrs. Dora Trundle was not present. She had been taken to the infirmary in the early hours, accompanied, at her own insistence, by a Bible and no solicitor. The vicar's voice, when he spoke, was hollow but composed. "She said you'd found everything beneath the vines."
"I didn't believe her. I still can't." Purbright regarded him steadily.
"The truth rarely asks for belief, Reverend."
"Only acknowledgement." He opened the ledger.
Its pages, speckled with soil and gilt, told their story with an accountant's precision. "The parish roof fund," Purbright said softly, "was used, at least in part, to cover debts incurred by your wife's various charitable projects. Sewing circles, choir trips, luncheon schemes, all noble causes, of course, just conducted with a creativity the diocese would not have appreciated." The vicar bowed his head. She thought she could replace the money before anyone noticed.
"I trusted her completely." "Indeed," Purbright murmured.
And when Mrs. Merrion noticed, she became a problem not of faith, but of finance. Dora Trundle was not a wicked woman, Reverend, merely an ambitious one. Ambition, when dressed as virtue, can commit astonishing sins. He paused, then unwrapped the small wooden transmitter box. A faint smell of damp wiring filled the air. "She built this herself," he said, using the wire from Mr. Teal's shop and a salvaged voice coil from the fairground. She'd recorded Mrs. Merrion's name on a small wax cylinder, an old toy phonograph, I believe. The whisper was played by a simple pressure switch embedded in the pumpkin stem.
"Ingenious, if morbidly so." The vicar stared at it in disbelief.
"But why?
"Why the voice?"
Why make the town think it was her?" "To distract them," said Purbright quietly. "A haunting is far more comfortable than corruption."
"People gossip about ghosts, not ledgers." He looked toward the curtained window, where faint light leaked through like doubt through conviction.
"She told me last night. Mrs. Merrion came here to confront her. Tempers rose. In the scuffle the poor woman fell against the paving stone by the vine bed. It might have been mercy, had your wife confessed then, but pride forbade it. The The vicar's shoulders sagged. "She buried her there," Purbright nodded. "She did. And when guilt began whispering louder than the choir, she tried to make everyone hear it too by giving the pumpkin a voice. It was, in a grim way, her confession." He closed the box.
Unfortunately, confessions whispered to vegetables rarely hold up in court. At that moment, the door creaked open.
Sergeant Love entered, hat in hand, his usual clumsiness subdued by the morning's gravity. "They've confirmed the identification, sir," he said. "Mrs. Merrion. The coroner estimates she's been dead about 3 weeks. There's evidence of a head injury consistent with a fall." Purbright inclined his head. "Thank you, Love." The vicar raised his eyes. "Will there be a trial?" "There must," Purbright said, "though I expect the jury will see the difference between malice and madness. Your wife will have sympathy, if not absolution." The vicar gave a small, helpless nod. "She was a good woman, Inspector. Proud, yes, but good. She meant to serve God." Purbright rose, his expression unreadable. "Many have, Reverend. It's often how we come to trouble him most directly." Outside, the morning light had grown bolder, revealing the garden's ruin beneath its beauty. The vine patch, once so carefully tended, now resembled a battlefield, the soil turned over by police spades, the frost melting into dark veins of earth. Purbright stood beside it, his hands clasped behind him, his breath clouding faintly in the air. Love approached from the path carrying his notebook. "We've finished the excavation, sir. Just the box and the remains of some canvas wrapping. No personal items," Purbright nodded. "She removed them, most likely the night she fainted. Guilt has an odd sense of housekeeping." Love hesitated.
"It's strange, isn't it?"
"She buried the evidence in the same place she grew her prize pumpkin, like she wanted to make something good out of it." Purbright looked down at the churned soil. "People are rarely content with guilt, Love. They like to plant something over it. A new life, a project, a sermon. It makes the ground look respectable again." He watched the sunlight creep across the vines, their frost turning to water. But time is an excellent gardener. It always digs things up eventually. By mid-morning, a few curious parishioners had begun to gather near the gate, their whispers carried by the cold air. The church bell tolled 10:30, its note flat and hollow. Purbright and Love walked toward the road. Behind them, the vicar remained at the edge of the garden, staring into the broken soil as though waiting for forgiveness to sprout. "Will they arrest her today?" Love asked quietly. "When she's well enough," said Purbright. "The law, unlike conscience, observes the doctor's orders." They reached the path by the churchyard, where the frost still clung stubbornly to the grass. The inspector paused, gazing up at the bell tower. "Funny, isn't it?" Love said after a moment. "All that fuss, ghost voices, fairground tricks, and it just came down to money." "Not money," Purbright said softly. "Fear. The kind that hides behind duty, wrapped up in scripture and good intentions." Mrs. Trundle was terrified not of prison but of disgrace. In towns like this, the two are indistinguishable. He turned toward the square where life had already resumed its routines. A milk cart rattled by. A shopkeeper adjusted his sign. The world, relieved by closure, had returned to being ordinary again. Love cleared his throat. "Do you believe she'll confess fully, sir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Oh, she already has, Love. Every confession has its own language." Hers was a whisper. As they reached the station steps, a pale sun broke through the mist, touching the rooftops with reluctant gold. The bell of St. Jude's began again, steady now, untroubled. Purbright stopped, listening for a moment. "Funny thing," Love said. "After all that—" "It almost sounds like the town's at peace again," Purbright nodded once. "For now." He looked back toward the vicarage, where the vines trembled faintly in the wind.
"Peace in Flaxborough, Love,
is only the interval between one silence and the next." He adjusted his hat, stepped inside the station, and closed the door gently behind him. The frost that had silvered Flaxborough all week was gone by Sunday. In its place came drizzle, a dull, persistent kind that flattened optimism and made umbrellas into declarations of defeat. Yet despite the weather and recent events, St. Jude's was fuller than it had been in months. People had come, ostensibly, to give thanks for the harvest, but mostly to see. They wished to witness how a vicar led prayers with his wife in police custody, and whether a scandal, if dressed in hymnals, could pass for sanctity. Inspector Purbright was there too, not in uniform, but seated halfway down the nave beside Sergeant Love, whose hymn-singing bore the solemn fervour of a man hoping for divine credit. The service, conducted by the Reverend Trundle, was simple, subdued. He read from the book of Isaiah in a voice cracked by exhaustion. The earth mourneth and fadeth away. The haughty people of the earth do languish. No mention was made of Mrs. Merrion, nor of pumpkins, nor of buried truths. But the parishioners, sensing the weight of omission, bowed their heads with the deep satisfaction of those who have had their curiosity justified by tragedy. When the final hymn faded, Purbright waited until the crowd had drained out into the drizzle before rising. He walked slowly to the front pew, where the vicar stood motionless, staring at the altar. "Courageous service," Purbright said quietly. Trundle turned, eyes hollow but steady.
"I wondered if you'd come. I usually do after unpleasantness."
The acoustics are excellent for reflection. The vicar's mouth twisted in something not quite a smile. "You think I'm a coward, Inspector?" Purbright considered.
"I think you're English, Reverend."
"That covers most possibilities." Trundle gave a low laugh, more weary than amused. "You know, she always believed God tested character through temptation. She never understood that he more often tests it through embarrassment." Purbright inclined his head. A distinction worth preaching. He offered his hand, and after a hesitant pause, the vicar took it, a small gesture of exhausted civility between two men who understood the futility of judgment. Outside, the drizzle had thickened. Across the square, life had resumed its slow, decent rhythm. Mrs. Glossop was telling anyone within earshot that she had always known the vicar's wife had something feverish in the eyes. Mr. Teal had reopened his electrical shop, proudly displaying a sign that read, "Light restored to St. Jude's by Teals of Flaxborough." And Mrs. Copplestone had placed an extra bouquet on the church window-sill. Lilies for purity, chrysanthemums for gossip. Only Mrs. Hodge, the retired postmistress, seemed unimpressed. She shook her head at the passing police van and muttered, "Terrible waste of good soil, all that digging." By Monday, official business had been concluded. Mrs. Dora Trundle had given a full statement. Accidental death, concealment out of fear, and the contrivance of a whispering. Pumpkin to quiet her conscience. She had refused a solicitor and requested only a clergyman. Not her
husband at the Crown would likely reduce the
charge from murder to manslaughter. The press, having exhausted its capacity for moral outrage, had already moved on to a story about a missing councillor's cat. In the police station, the ledger, the letter, and the transmitter box sat in sealed envelopes. Awaiting archive, Purbright regarded them with the faint distaste one reserves for unpleasant but necessary relics. "Funny thing, sir," said Love, dusting his boots, "how it all comes down to small things, wire, soil, vegetables." "Most crimes do," Purbright said. "Grand motives are for novels. In Flaxborough, evil prefers manageable proportions." He leaned back in his chair, the ghost of a smile flickering. "It's the only way people can live with it, by pretending it's just an unfortunate misunderstanding involving gardening equipment." Love grinned awkwardly. "Suppose it makes your job easier, sir?" "On the contrary," said Purbright, "it makes it endless." That afternoon, the inspector walked once more through the market square, where the stalls were back in place as though no whisper had ever echoed through their tents. The smell of damp produce mingled with frying onions. The world had resumed its appetite. He passed the table where the Harvest Majesty pumpkin had once sat, now replaced by a modest display of parsnips and cabbages, all blessedly mute. From a nearby shop, a wireless played faint music, something light and forgettable. Life, Purbright reflected, had a knack for whistling past graves. He paused at the florist's, where Mrs. Copplestone was arranging violets. She looked up, smiling thinly. "Morning, Inspector. Heard they'll be planting new vines at the vicarage come spring." "How appropriate," he murmured. "The soil's well turned." She tittered, not quite sure whether it was safe to laugh. "You'll have a quiet spell now, I dare say." Purbright's gaze drifted toward the church tower, half lost in mist. "Quiet is a relative term, Mrs. Copplestone. In Flaxborough, it's just what you hear before the next scandal clears its throat." He thanked her politely and continued on, the drizzle beading on his hat brim. That evening, he sat alone in his office. The case files were neatly stacked, their edges squared as though obedience might redeem them. From outside came the muffled sound of rain against the windows and the distant toll of the church bell. He lit his pipe. Though it went out twice before taking, there was, he thought, a peculiar symmetry in it all. A missing woman, a guilty conscience, a whispering pumpkin, the old English cocktail of sin, secrecy and seasonal produce. He smiled faintly. Somewhere, Dora Trundle would be praying. Somewhere else, Edith Merion's name would finally rest in the earth rather than on someone's tongue. He tapped ash gently into the tray. "Peace at last," he murmured. Then, after a pause, "until the next harvest." The bell tolled again, one slow, measured note, and the sound folded back into the stillness.